Hello and welcome to another adventure in Australian literature. We're doing something a little different this week, mostly because I'm teaching a lot and my brain is in two different places, so yeah. So that's, I'm not exactly bringing you a book, but before we get started, remember there is our shop. If you want to support us, we have our books. There is a Redbubble shop with a lot of merch. There's also writing services on our shop. So if you want to come and support us, that's how you come and support us. Also, if you enjoy the video, like, subscribe. We put out a new video every week. So that out of the way, let's talk about what we're doing this week. So I'm not bringing you a book because we were going to bring you a book. Janice was going to bring you Waiting for the Barbarians, so I think that will have to wait till next week. But I am here to talk to you about what makes Australian writing unique. What makes it Australian? So I'll give you some why I'm in this place mentally. Is I had to read a book for work, which I don't have to do very often, but it was a book that the children were struggling with, and I honestly haven't taught that book in 20 years. It was like my first or second year of teaching, so nearly 20 years since I'd read that book. I knew it wasn't a great book. I couldn't remember anything about it. It was just nothing. My head was blank. So I had to reread it. And rereading it, I understood why the children were struggling with it. But it also made me think, oh, they're not recognizing themselves. Which didn't surprise me, because since reading that book the first time and now rereading that, time I will never get back, I've read a lot of Australian writing. And this was a book that was purporting to be an Australian book. It was published in Australia, has an Australian setting. It's not Australian. It's not Australian. And that was actually something that was causing difficulty for the students to engage with, because there was a cognitive dissonance between the setting of the book and the style of the book. They don't have this problem when they're reading foreign books, because they're adjusted to, oh, this is American, this is English, whatever. That's a code that they're understanding. But this one, not having a lot of experience with Australian books, because there just aren't a lot that are necessarily taught. It's quite hard to get a hold of Australian books, good Australian books for really sort of teenage audiences. It's actually kind of hard to find them. Because they had no understanding of Australian books from that perspective, but they were also reading a book that, well, let's say it was current 40 years ago, or in 1986, nearly 40 years ago. The Cold War needed explaining to them. The idea of nuclear war needed explaining to them, because they live in a post-perestroika world. So that they couldn't connect on that level. It was, and I'm not saying that this is a must, like a universal problem, but the author wasn't Australian. The author was English. And this, I think, caused part of that cognitive dissonance for the students. It certainly caused cognitive dissonance for me. When I read, oh, the author's English, that explains an awful lot about this book. That explains why the characters don't they feel like they're putting on an, they don't even feel like they're putting on an accent. They don't feel like they come from this country. So that was a problem. He's English, and he had spent a lot of time in his teenage years in Africa, which, explained by the indigenous character, was coded African. Which was a problem, because the assumption on the author's point was black in Australia equates to black in Africa, where those are two entirely different cultures, and especially Africa is not a monolith. Africa is, as anyone with a bit of sense will tell you, Africa is as diverse culturally a place as Europe or South America. It is not, or Asia. It is not a monolith. It is a culturally diverse area. And yet this person had clearly decided that Indigenous Australians, with their unique history, their unique culture, were equatable to sub-Saharan Africans. That's a problem. That's really actually quite, it's more than a little bit of a problem, it's really quite insulting to our Indigenous peoples. So we're having problems with this book. And this made me think, well, what does constitute Australian writing? What is this book not doing? Even if it has an Australian setting, a Sydney setting, what is this not doing that an Australian book does do, regardless of its setting? Because we have authors who have emigrated, who've gone overseas. Christina Steed still writes Australian books, although they got a bit mangled. Patrick White's English books don't quite work as English books, don't quite work as Australian books. It's a voice that got mangled, but once he came home, oh, he knew what to write. His first book is also in the right accent. It was when he was attempting to write English books that his accent got blurred. So what would I say constitutes Australian writing? Because I found I could not write a book set in Australia until I had read my country. It wouldn't work. I could not make I couldn't make it read right, which is an interesting thing. But we do have a tradition. And it's, you're looking at that we have two big traditions in this country. We have Indigenous writing, which is its own thing, and not what I'm actually going to be talking about today. Indigenous writing is its own style of writing. It is unique to the Indigenous people of Australia, but it is not something that someone outside of that can write. It is a unique perspective on the world and experience, and that's one style of Australian writing. The other style of Australian writing, it comes out of the Anglo-Celtic settler society, and it is predominantly Anglo-Celtic, and other ethnicities within Australia generally write within or against that. So that is the big style that you are either fitting yourself into or opposing in some way. But this is the style you cannot ignore. So what makes it Australian? Well, we do have a unique literary genre, which is Australian Gothic, and I've talked about Australian Gothic before. But all Australian writing has certain things that work within it. Now, it's very odd to talk about some of these things because they're things that you almost don't notice until you realise that these are things that we do that nobody else does. And they're also things that aren't necessarily noticeable to outsiders, to non-Australians. And it's part of the reason our coding can be quite subtle and quite insular, which is why some of our arts products don't work on the world stage. I'm thinking about this also because I had seen some Americans talking about, I heard some Americans talking about Moulin Rouge and not getting it. And we think that's funny. We think that's really funny. But our humour is very, very particular. And I will get back to humour in a moment. But some things that are unique to Australian writing. The weather. I know the English think that they have a monopoly on the weather. You have not read about the weather until you've read an Australian novel. Oh boy. It's not just the weather though. It is the physicality of living in the country. It is the heat or the cold and how that makes your body feel. You are never... In Australia, there are very few months of the year where you are never, where you can pretty much ignore that you are a physical thing, that you have a physical body, you wear clothes, you're going to sweat, or you're going to be cold. The sensual aspect of having a body is something that really grounds Australian literature. You are going to be in... When you read Australian things, you're going to be in a character, not just in a character's head, but in their body. It is a very physical thing, Australian literature, which is, I think, something that I have not seen to such an extent in other countries' literature. We're a country that likes to whine about the weather, and not even whine about it, but just be aware of it. It's not even complaining, it's just an awareness. Another aspect of the Australian novel is both conformity and community. I will put these as either end of the same scale. Patrick White certainly talks about the conformity end of that. Others will focus on the community end. Part of the reason why you have a critique of conformity is because we are not a country of hyper-individualization like, say, America. We are not, because our history refused to allow us to be. We are a country where if you have a natural disaster every other week, you kind of have to pull together or you're going to fail. And that has been the history of our country, of white settlement in this country for the past 230 something years, 35 years, 30 something. Yeah, 35 years. If you don't pull together, you're going to fall apart. You're going to fall apart separately. The sense of community is enormous. One book that it made me think of was that while I was reading this book for work, and this is a book where people really have community has completely and utterly fallen down. One of the things it made me think of was Kylie Tennant's The Battlers, and not because The Battlers are about people who've fallen down. The Battlers is about, as if you've seen my video on that, The Battlers is about people who really, there is no reason these people should help anyone. They have nothing to help each other with, and yet they do. They do. They come together. They form a community. It is a community outside the settled towns, but they are a community within the travelling workers, within the travellers. The little group that forms around Snow, of the Stray and Miss Pips and the busker, and the busker's, by the end of the book, the busker's girlfriend. This is a community. None of these people have to remain together. They've pulled apart from each other and been drawn back together, and pulled apart and drawn back together. They've relied on the mutual assistance of each other, the mutual assistance of other travellers. The sense of community is just so tied, and it is a sense of community that pervades rural stories. It is a sense of community that even comes into urban stories. That sense of community is something that is essential within Australian narratives. So to read a book wherein everyone has a hyper individualistic, more American sort of a very, very American mentality was, and I'm not sure maybe an English mentality, but certainly I've seen mostly as an American mentality, was just like, this doesn't read like Australia. To have a constant level of antagonism, to have everybody at each other, to have a constant level of conflict, is not a constituent of what I would, with my experience of reading Australians, read as Australian. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have conflict. That doesn't mean you don't have predatory behaviour. Look at the Australian Gothic. It's incredibly conflict-filled and incredibly... there are incredible predatory characters in Australian Gothic novels, and yet there is still community. Of course, Patrick White will argue there comes a point where community becomes conformity and where conformity becomes toxic, which absolutely is true. But we don't have a lot of stories of rampant individualism. So the flip side of community, the supportive community, is the toxic conformity, not the individual. So that's an interesting aspect of the Australian narrative. So another one that I have certainly come up against, and I've talked about various examples, and we'll have more examples, is women. Australian women have a very particular character. They form often the heart of these communities. They are, but they can be both the great nurturing glue that holds a community together, or they can be the really nasty, toxic influence that enforces conformity. So we have these two very, not the damned whores and God's police, but the nurturers and the poisoners, I would say. And that's really interesting. And in the book that I'm going to do next, we have an example of both a nurturer and a poisoner in the same book. So that will be an interesting thing to look at. So that strong female, like these are not strong female characters as in the way that people will code them, as in essentially doing everything a man does. They are very female, they're very feminine, or they exist within a very female world, but they're very, very strong. They're also not Mary Sues. So, as I said, you can have the poisoners as well as the nurturers. You can have some exceptionally toxic, nasty, vicious female characters in Australian literature, but they're memorable. You're going to remember them. Why is this something that I didn't see? I didn't see it. They have a woman. Yes, they have two. The book has two female characters. One is a child, and one is basically that strong female character who is basically a man in a skirt type of thing. So she's not coded right for an Australian female character. She is just, oh, I better put some more women into this, so let's make the leader of this gang a woman. But there's nothing coded particularly, apart from the fact that this character has a female name. Ultimately, she's not coded as an Australian woman. Isabella Melville may be really fierce and a spiky little creature, and the anger may be the point, but she's not a male character in a skirt. She's very much a female character. So that is an issue. Finally, I would say that humour is the big, huge, massive thing that comes into Australian writing. You have to have humour. There's got to be jokes. And not jokes. Australian humour is extremely dry. It can be extremely sardonic. It can be unbelievably dark. But it's always there. There is a famous cartoon, which I will put up here, from the Great Depression. Stop laughing. This is, for God's sake, stop laughing. This is serious. It is a cartoon that has been used as emblematic of Australian humour since it was first published. As I said about the weather, the concept of Australia has a natural disaster every other week. If you didn't laugh, you'd cry. It's a tough country, and the way that you survive in a tough country is you've got to laugh. If you can't laugh, you're sunk. It's also partly why our books are not as... You don't get really despairing endings in Australian novels. There's always a chink of light. There is always hope. And there is always humour. And now humour is hard for people to understand outside our country. I'm not sure if The Castle makes sense outside of Australia, but it is a beloved film in Australia. Muriel's Wedding is a beloved film in Australia. It is dark as dark. It has disability, it has bullying, it has mental illness, it has a whole host of really serious themes, and it's funny. It's very funny. And it's partly that carries across in a lot of things. We are the only country I can think of that has a constitutional crisis with a comedian right smack bang in the middle. Come on, look up any vision of the Whitlam dismissal, and right there, in the middle of it, pretending to be a journalist, is, and also revving up the crowd, is the comedian Gary MacDonald playing his useless journalist, Norman Gunston. This is a character who would give bad interviews to incoming celebrities, and depending on how they reacted, whether they got the joke or not everyone got the joke that Norman Gunston was a comic creation and not a real journalist asking really inane questions. And he is there in the biggest constitutional crisis this country has ever had, the dismissal of a Prime Minister and a government by the Governor-General. Okay, that's Australia. that is how you... Could you imagine that in America? Or in the UK? Or anywhere else? No. Humour is central. And if a text is serious, you can guarantee we will then go and make fun of it outside of the text. I suggest, if you want to see a perfect example of this, have a look at the classic Australian film Picnic at Hanging Rock. Just have a look at that anyway, because it's brilliant. It's an Australian Gothic and beautiful. Then have a look at the fast forward skits with Magda Sabansky. So funny. Serious film, satire. And both of those sit there. I know a lot of countries will satirize things, but we'll take that to... We'll do humour. Humour will get into just about everything we do. And we're quite... we've got very dry humour, so it isn't always understood. Australian literature has got its own style, has got its own flavour. And yeah, it's a mistake to assume just because something has an Australian setting that it counts as Australian, if you haven't really looked at what makes it what it is. So anyway, I will be back next time with a book. So I will be back with a book instead of a long rambling talk. Thank you for your patience. I literally just could not do a book this week. So there we go. I will be back later with another book, and Janice will be bringing Waiting for the Barbarians next week. So bye-bye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.